Hello everyone, this is Patrick Bolin from Macrospect, and today we're going to talk a little bit about exploring artificial intelligence in financial planning and analysis. Just to give you a little bit of background on Macrospect, we're an SAP partner who's been in the ecosystem for 20 years now, and we are not a generalist consulting firm. We specialize in the areas of FP&A, consolidations, and the analytics that are attached to those. And in the course of that 20 years, we've done over 800 projects for Fortune 1000 clients, just like the ones you see on this page. This is not a complete list of our clients, but as you can see, there's some very large companies, very complicated companies on this screen. And these are the types of clients that we're working with to solve problems from their budgeting and forecasting standpoint and how they consolidate their actuals. So today, I just want to talk a little bit about real world use cases. We hear about AI in the news now almost every day, right? Any newspaper you open, the top headline is typically an article about artificial intelligence and what does it mean and what are the risks and what are the dangers. So we just want to get a little more real and talk about a real life example of how clients are using this technology to really better their FP&A and accounting teams. So the issue, as I see it, is a couple of things. When you're talking about finance and accounting, they feel pressure, right? We as an industry feel pressure to use AI because, again, our companies are seeing that there's a lot of investment being made and it seems like groundbreaking technology, but it's a little daunting. Why, right? So for one reason, we're not data scientists. We're numbers people. We're used to working with algebra and mathematics to calculate things. We're not really digging deep into the numbers or the mathematical algorithms that cause them to be what they are. We're just trying to get a process executed every day and one that we can do reliably so that when we report numbers out, either whether it's to our investment community or to our auditors, that we know they're accurate. And in our jobs, there's some real consequences of not doing that well, right? Sarbanes-Oxley, as an example, we can be terminated for legal liability if the reported numbers aren't correct. Also, if you're in FP&A, then there's a real career risk. If you consistently miss your forecast, then you get fired and have to go find another job because the companies really value not just the numbers themselves, but the accuracy of the prediction of the numbers. The other thing, if we're just being honest, is we're smart people. Most people in finance and accounting are very smart and they trust their instincts. And so that confidence that comes with that kind of personality makes it hard for us to trust computer-generated numbers, right, where we don't understand the details of how we got to the numbers. And then if we're just being truthful, most of us grew up in an era where we watched movies like The Terminator and The Matrix, and so AI is a little scary, and we don't want necessarily to have the world taken over by computers, and we certainly don't want to have our jobs replaced by computers. So we have to be thoughtful about how we're going to use this technology, and we have to trust the results. And that's also a problem because typically in finance and accounting, we're working with sales team members and plant managers where part of their compensation is tied to these numbers in the forecast and the results in the forecast. And they don't want to be held accountable for their performance in a number where they didn't come up with the number. So the other part of the issue is that if you think about finance and accounting traditionally work in silos. So they have processes that they're comfortable using for their departments, but they don't necessarily contemplate the other department. So finance thinks about accounting, but doesn't really contemplate accounting and how they do things every day. Accounting thinks about finance, but not vice versa, right? So we're actually trying to figure out how do we create a process that connects the two. And in our current world, there are a lot of issues with that because typically we're sort of walled off from one another, not intentionally, but just by the nature of the work that we do. And because of that process being walled off, right, we see some results. One is that things tend to be error prone. We have a lot of manual processes, especially in FP&A, and we rely on spreadsheets a lot, and spreadsheets contain errors. And it doesn't matter how much diligence you put into it. Think about it. If a CFO gets a forecast spreadsheet and they find an error, it can be error-free in 99% of the content, but if they find an error on the first line, they immediately don't trust anything they see in the rest of the spreadsheet. And that's a real problem that we have to deal with almost every day. The other thing is because most of these processes and how finance and accounting work with each other are time-consuming, that we really spend a lot of time focused on what I would call low-value tasks. We're not using our brains, right? We're using email and files and SneakerNet to just make sure that we're passing data along from team to team without really any time to think about, is the forecast telling us something meaningful about our business? Are our actuals, is there something in the numbers that's actually a surprise that we would want to take action on? We're just trying to get through the process because we don't have a lot of time, right? And everything takes a lot of time. And then the other thing is, oftentimes there's an issue where we do come up with a good idea and we might even share that idea, but we don't really have good mechanisms, systematic mechanisms to follow up and make sure that we're getting clarity on those issues and that we're actually finding out the root cause and communicating it well. So what tends to happen is a poor result may happen 3 or 4 or even 5 times before somebody actually takes action to solve it permanently. And then the last piece, again, is because accounting's focused on closing the books. Finance is focused on the forecast, and we're all really busy. Most of our clients now are really, really lean. So because of those two things, we're not really thinking about collaborating with each other. Again, we're just thinking about executing the process, which can be painful. So how do we solve this? It really is about changing our mindsets. And I just thought of a few points that I wanted to make and how that can happen. So first of all, and this is from real clients where they've started to rethink how they work together. One is accounting needs to change their thought process around their role. They're not really just executing the close process or just executing the accounting processes. Accounting is a service provider of data that we use to measure and manage the effectiveness of how the company is run. And that data needs to be captured at the right level of detail to actually analyze the performance in our business and make meaningful changes when they're required. Now, finance or FP&A needs to change their mindset too. They're not just executing a forecast process. They're a coach and a guide to the business. These are really smart people who understand in the numbers how a business works and functions, and they can actually get insight quickly because they do look at those numbers all the time. But they have to start to think about how do they change their role to help others in the business do the same thing so that the operational teams are getting ahead of problems, communicating back to finance where more analysis can be done. So accounting's providing the data, finance is the coach and mentor, the operations team is thinking about these problems, and they're all collaborating and communicating with each other. So it's a partnership. So then the question is, how does AI fit into that partnership? So I'm going to give you an example from a real client. So first of all, they asked us to make a picture, just a simple picture that helped them understand how they should think about this. And this is the picture that we came up with because effectively everybody in finance and accounting wants things to be boring. We don't want to have misses in our forecast. We don't want to have surprises when we do consolidations. We basically want to say what we're going to do and have the numbers show that we actually did what we said from the company's performance standpoint. So in our mind, that starts with planning. That's the end, right? Begin with the end in mind. Planning and forecasting is what we're saying we're going to do. Now we need data to do that well. So the financial data is basically supplied by the accounting department and the operating units of the company. And then the beginning of that is financial management. When we enter transactions in our operational systems, are those transactions actually capturing the right data at the right level of granularity so that we can now measure the effectiveness of our strategic plans and our execution towards those strategic plans? And again, if this is done really well, it can be brilliant, but it should also be boring. In the AI world, here's an example from a real client. And I'm going to show you how we measured the effectiveness of this. So if you think of these as swim lanes, right? I have accounting, I have my executives, I have the finance team, and I have the business unit leaders. So it starts at a very high level. The executives are the ones generating revenue targets for the company. And those targets are going to cascade down to the business units. The finance team is the one that's responsible for saying, for each business unit, here's the revenue expectations we have. And that revenue expectation might also have a margin expectation. But finance is the one doing that work. Then the business units team responsibility is to really take those revenue expectations from finance and allocate those down to their field sales reps. And the reason we do that in the business unit is because they understand their customers. They understand their team members' strengths and weaknesses. They understand what's likely to happen in the interactions between those teams in the field. So we want to give them local control over how to allocate revenue targets down to a rep level. And they can choose to do that the same for every rep. They can choose to do it different for different reps, different products. It's really up to them. But they're the ones making those allocations. So here's the challenge. They're not always right? They're just human beings, and those human beings are also thinking about different sorts of things. And so they're going to create a forecast and a rep sales forecast that really follows their gut instinct and the historical numbers that they have. But we want to have a way to validate whether those gut instincts and local control instincts are correct. And so this is where AI can come into play. If you look at this finance swim lane and accounting has been capturing detailed data in SAP S/4HANA and SAP Datasphere for this client for a number of years, 3 or 4 years of data, which is about what we need to really get an accurate AI-based forecast. And finance is now going to take that and use the AI capability in SAP Analytics Cloud to generate their own version of the sales plan by territory. So the BU leaders are allocating targets by territory. The AI plan is also going to calculate a forecast by territory. And we're really just looking at historically, if this is the level of performance for these products in these territories, in these different business units, then what does that history tell us is most likely to occur, It doesn't mean it's 100% right, because sometimes things change, but we have to have a baseline. And SAC's AI capabilities will generate that sales plan, and then we're going to match that up to what the business unit comes with. So now we've got a comparative. The business unit team is saying this is what's going to happen. The historical numbers say this is what's going to happen. And what we're really doing there is we're assessing portfolio risk, And the finance team can come back to the business unit and say, hey, I understand what you're forecasting, but history tells us that that's not likely to happen. So for instance, you're saying in your forecast that we're going to sell 1,000 units of this product to this customer in this channel. But the history tells us that it's more likely going to be 700 to 800 products. So let's have a discussion. What makes you think it's going to be more? And they may have a valid reason for that, and that's okay, but we're going to mark that as a risk item, Because it means we're going to exceed by some number of standard deviations any historical performance that we've ever had. And so now we've tracked that. We can actually track the suggestions in the tool. Here's the action items that we've agreed to that we're going to review. What caused the deviation of 100? Is there an outside event that we think is going to happen? Can we track whether the event actually occurred or not? So now we've systematically captured those items, those tracking things that we're also measuring, because if they don't come to fruition, then we know immediately the forecast needs to change, And probably go back to something that's more like what the AI generated forecast says. So we've got the two forecasts, we've compared, we've had our discussions, we've reviewed and adjusted where it makes sense, and now we're going to recommend a plan to the executives that says, this is what we think the forecast is likely to be. Now, executives being executives, they have the right to review and adjust and finalize the plan. And they're going to do that for this client. They're actually in the process of doing it for this client. But what those executives are doing now that they never had before is they never had a real assessment in the details of where there's likely risk in their forecast, because they never had a comparative, from the AI engine. So now not only can they say, here's what I think we're going to achieve, we actually have a way of measuring the risk in a forecast, anywhere from no risk at all, because we're just saying we're going to achieve what we've historically done, to these specific items have risk because these are the areas where we feel like we're going to underperform or overperform our history. And with this client, we actually are measuring how we're doing that at different levels of the business. So let me give you some examples. At the lowest level, at the business unit level, they're actually looking at what are the percentage of sales territories in the forecast, right at the beginning of the year, the annual operating plan, that we say we're going to exceed the AI forecast. And we're doing it in kind of a high, medium, low methodology, meaning if it's less than one standard deviation, then that's not bad. If it's 2, it's getting a little worse. And if it's 3, it's getting a little worse. So if I look at the percentage of sales territories, if it's a very high number and we say only 2% of our sales territories are going to exceed the AI forecast, that's probably a low risk forecast. If 25% of our sales territories are saying they're going to exceed historical performance, that's a high risk forecast. And then we do the same thing each month when we do our reforecast, our last best estimate, right? So our 1 and 11, our 2 and 10, our 3 and 9, we go back and we say, well, what are the actuals and forecasts? So if I'm halfway through the year, as an example, I'm doing my 6x6 forecast, and I've got a territory where I only achieved 30% of the forecasted revenue for the first half of the year, but yet the business team is saying we're going to recapture that 30%, plus we're going to do the full 100% for the rest of the year. I would view that as a very high risk, right? Very high risk area. And so we're measuring, again, what percent of sales territories where actual and forecast is going to exceed the AI forecast. And then we have a statistical likelihood that we can actually measure at the BU level of which territories in the business unit, which business units are going to hit their forecast, at least from a statistical likelihood standpoint, or they're going to miss. And then we start to roll that up. So at a regional level, think of their sales forecast now as a portfolio of risk. How many territories, how many business units are likely to achieve their forecast? How many are not? And what's the statistical likelihood of achieving the regional forecast? And then the same thing, we roll it up to the company level. So we can actually see when the CFO sits down and looks at the forecast, not only are they looking at numbers, but they're also looking at a risk analysis that says, what's the statistical likelihood of us achieving the corporate forecast? And they can see all the way down to the details. So if they want to make an adjustment, rather than say, hey, I just want a 3% improvement or 3% reduction at the top, I actually am interested in these territories, these business units, these specific items. So now we're having a much more effective conversation about the changes and the risk at the executive level. This is a whole new world for us. So now for those clients, we have to change a few things and we want to measure some things. So the first thing is to really do this well, accounting has to start thinking of themselves as a service provider of data. So we need 30 periods of data to really have an accurate generated forecast. Most of them don't have that now, but the goal is over time to change that mentality and capture that data. So we have good historical data to rely on. For this client specifically, we're looking at a 70% reduction in the manual effort to generate a forecast. Why? Because they're not having to spend time in the areas where they're likely forecasting accurately. They really need to spend time on the areas where the forecast is off, where we think we have risk, right? And that used to take tons of time and tons of spreadsheets. Now most of it's being done in a system. The other thing is we specifically want to look at reducing their forecast accuracy variance from 6%, which is where it currently is, which means at the end of the year, the actuals are typically 6% off from what the forecast was. We want to get that from 6% to 2%. Now, what does that mean? Well, this is a large company, and actually we've got several clients doing this exact same thing. So for a $20 billion company, that 6% to 2% forecast accuracy really means that those field sales reps now have targets that are more realistic, and they can achieve the targets. And so human nature, if I'm halfway through the year and I've only achieved 20% of my target, then I'm not likely to double my efforts. I'm actually more likely to give up on the rest of the year. And that giving up actually has a bottom line effect on the company. Or I just leave the job and now I've got an open position, which is even worse because now I've got an uncovered territory. So if we can get from 6% to 2% and basically keep everybody's spirits high and their opportunity to achieve their forecast higher, it means we get their very best efforts all the way through the year. And we think with this client, that could be a net revenue increase of $100 million for a very small forecasting project that uses a very reasonably priced planning tool. $100 million bottom line effect. That is a huge number. And the return on investment of that is 100x over what the cost of the project is going to be. Actually, it's a little higher than that. So we just think there's incredible value from this technology, and it's not letting the machines take over the world. It's just using them as another tool to help us identify risk in areas where we're not likely going to achieve our forecasts unless we're really smart about how we set the targets and the numbers. So again, I think over time we're going to find lots and lots of applications for this technology, but this is a very real example for a client where we believe they're going to have a short project, 3 months, maybe 4 months to go live and get a net $100 million impact in the very first year the project is live. So probably a lot of other examples that we can talk about, but I thought I would just share this one because I think it helps all of us think about what's a more practical application of this technology and how can we leverage it to benefit our companies beyond just making our jobs easier or making things go faster. So I thank you for your time. And if any of you have any questions, I put my email here on the screen. You're more than welcome to reach out for a discussion. Have a great day.